On the surface, Willow Creek was an idyllic suburb where families lived in neat, well-kept houses and everyone knew their neighbors. But beneath its picturesque exterior, secrets festered, and one such secret would eventually lead to a tragedy that shook the entire community. Lydia Harper, at 37, was known as the elegant and charming wife of Greg Harper, a successful architect. They had moved to Willow Creek 5 years ago, hoping for a fresh start after a difficult period in their marriage. Lydia had struggled with feelings of loneliness and insecurity for years. Despite her outwardly perfect life, complete with a luxurious home, 2 teenage children, and a handsome husband, there was a void inside her that she couldn't fill. Greg's work often took him away from home, sometimes for weeks at a time. Though he was loving and caring, his frequent absences left Lydia feeling abandoned and unfulfilled. She sought solace in her garden, spending hours tending to her flowers and vegetables. It was during these lonely days that she struck up a friendship with their next-door neighbor, Alex Turner. Alex, in his early 40s, was a widower who had moved to Willow Creek shortly after Lydia and Greg. His wife had died in a car accident, leaving him to raise their son, Jake, alone. Jake, now 21, had recently returned home after dropping out of college. The two of them were somewhat of an oddity in the neighborhood, keeping to themselves and not engaging much with the other residents. Lydia's friendship with Alex began innocently enough. They bonded over their shared love for gardening, often exchanging tips and admiring each other's work. But as time went on, Lydia found herself drawn to Alex in ways she hadn't expected. He was kind, attentive, and unlike Greg, he was always around. Their conversations grew longer, filled with laughter and the kind of intimacy Lydia craved. One warm summer evening, after Greg had left for yet another business trip, Lydia invited Alex over for dinner. They sat on the patio, sharing a bottle of wine and reminiscing about their lives before Willow Creek. As the night went on, the boundaries between friendship and something more blurred. Lydia leaned in to kiss Alex, and he didn't pull away. That night marked the beginning of their affair. At first, they were cautious, meeting only when they were sure no one would see them. But as the months passed, they grew bolder. Alex would sneak over to Lydia's house when Greg was away, and they would spend entire nights together. Lydia felt alive again, the emptiness inside her replaced by the thrill of their forbidden romance. But the situation grew more complicated when Jake entered the picture. Unlike his father, Jake was outgoing and charismatic. He had a troubled past, having been expelled from several schools for fighting and other misconduct. Despite his flaws, there was something magnetic about him. He was reckless, unpredictable, and, as Lydia would soon discover, dangerously attractive. One evening, Lydia returned home from a shopping trip to find Jake waiting for her in the backyard. He had a mischievous grin on his face as he held out a bouquet of flowers he had picked from her garden. Lydia laughed and thanked him, slightly amused by his audacity. But as she reached out to take the flowers, Jake grabbed her hand and pulled her close. "I've seen the way you look at me," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Lydia tried to pull away, but Jake held her firmly. "You don't need my dad or your husband when you've got me right here." Lydia's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She wanted to push him away, to tell him he was wrong, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her, with a hunger she hadn't seen in years. Perhaps it was the thrill of the danger, the idea of something even more forbidden than her affair with Alex. Against her better judgment, Lydia kissed Jake. It was a brief, almost violent kiss, filled with a mix of anger and desire. She pushed him away, her face flushed with shame and excitement. "This can't happen," she said, her voice shaking. But even as she spoke the words, she knew she didn't mean them. Over the next few weeks, Lydia found herself entangled in a dangerous web of deceit and desire. She continued her affair with Alex, but now there was an added complication. Jake would visit her late at night, slipping into her house after his father had gone to bed. Their encounters were brief and intense, filled with the reckless passion of a forbidden affair. Lydia knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop herself. She was addicted to the thrill, the excitement of living on the edge. But what she didn't realize was that this dangerous game would soon spiral out of control, leading to a confrontation that would end in murder. By late October, Lydia's life had become a tangled mess of lies and deceit. She was balancing her secret liaisons with Alex and the increasingly risky encounters with Jake. Every day, she lived in fear of being discovered, yet she was unable to stop. It was a thrill, an addiction she couldn't break free from, and it was slowly tearing her apart. The tension between Jake and his father had also begun to escalate. Alex noticed the change in his son's behavior, his late nights out, his sudden outbursts of anger. What Alex didn't know was that his son was sneaking into Lydia's house under his nose. Jake, who had initially seen the affair as a game, was becoming possessive. He wanted more from Lydia, and he didn't care who got hurt in the process. Lydia, too, was starting to feel the strain. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, but she was trapped in a situation of her own making. Jake's presence in her life was becoming more volatile. He was no longer satisfied with their secret meetings. He wanted Lydia to leave Greg and be with him openly. It was a demand she couldn't fulfill, and that made him dangerous. One cold evening, things finally reached a breaking point. Greg had left for a business trip, and Lydia was home alone. She had planned to spend the night with Alex, but as she was getting ready, Jake showed up unannounced. There was a manic energy about him, a wild look in his eyes that sent a shiver down Lydia's spine. "We need to talk," Jake said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lydia glanced nervously at the clock. Alex would be there any minute. She tried to calm Jake down, but he was having none of it. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you can just use me and then throw me away?" he hissed. "You think I don't know what you're planning? You're going to leave me for my father." Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. "Jake, you're being ridiculous. That's not what's happening." But Jake was beyond reason. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight and painful. "You think I'm stupid? You've been playing both of us, but I'm not going to let you go." Lydia struggled against him, fear coursing through her veins. She had seen Jake angry before, but this was different. There was a dangerous glint in his eyes, a madness that terrified her. "Jake, please, let's talk about this," she pleaded, trying to break free. But before she could say more, they heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. Lydia's blood ran cold. Alex was here. Jake turned towards the window, his face contorting with rage. "You're still seeing him, aren't you?" he yelled. "You're going to leave me for him." Without warning, Jake pushed Lydia away and stormed into the kitchen. She stumbled and fell, her head hitting the corner of the coffee table. Pain shot through her skull, and she felt the warm trickle of blood down her face. Dazed, she watched as Jake rummaged through the kitchen drawers, finally pulling out a large kitchen knife. "Jake, no!" she screamed, but he wasn't listening. The front door opened, and Alex stepped inside, his face lighting up when he saw Lydia. But his smile faded as he noticed the blood on her forehead and Jake standing in the kitchen, holding the knife. "What the hell is going on?" Alex demanded. Taking a step towards Lydia, Jake raised the knife, his eyes wild with fury. "Stay back! You've ruined everything!" he shouted. Alex froze, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Jake, put the knife down. We can talk about this." But Jake was beyond reasoning. He lunged at Alex, the knife aimed at his chest. Lydia screamed as the two men collided, their bodies crashing against the wall. Alex struggled to defend himself, but Jake was fueled by a rage that made him almost unstoppable. In the chaos, Alex managed to grab Jake's wrist, twisting it with all his strength. The knife clattered to the floor, and Lydia scrambled to her feet, rushing to grab it. But as she reached out, Jake shoved Alex away and grabbed her, his fingers digging into her arm with bruising force. "You don't get to leave me!" Jake screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. With a sudden surge of strength, Lydia stabbed Jake in the side. He let out a gasp of pain and staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Blood seeped through his shirt, and he looked at her, his face twisted with disbelief. You stabbed me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lydia dropped the knife, her hands trembling. She backed away as Jake fell to his knees, clutching his side. Alex, bleeding and bruised, pulled himself up and stumbled towards her, his eyes filled with shock and horror. "We need to call an ambulance," Lydia whispered, her voice shaking, but it was too late. Jake collapsed onto the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached out a hand towards Lydia, his eyes filled with a pleading desperation. "Please, don't leave me," he murmured. Before his body went limp, the room fell silent, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Lydia stood frozen, staring at Jake's lifeless body, her mind struggling to comprehend the horror before her. Alex wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as they both stared at the bloody scene that had unfolded in the heart of her home. Lydia stood motionless, staring at Jake's lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor. Blood pooled around him, seeping into the cracks between the tiles. She could hear the ragged sound of her own breathing, each inhale sharp and painful. Alex's arms were wrapped tightly around her, but she could feel his body trembling as much as hers. "We have to call the police," Alex finally said, his voice strained and barely above a whisper. Lydia nodded numbly, but she couldn't make her legs move. Her eyes were fixed on Jake's vacant gaze, his hand still outstretched toward her, as if pleading for forgiveness. She felt a wave of nausea rise within her, and she tore herself away from Alex, stumbling into the bathroom. She barely made it to the sink before she started retching, the taste of bile bitter in her mouth. Alex followed her, placing a hand on her back, his voice filled with worry. "Lydia, we have to think. We need to get our story straight." She looked up at him, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Our story?" she echoed, her voice hollow. He nodded, his eyes darting toward the kitchen where Jake's body lay. "This was self-defense, right? He attacked us. We need to make sure the police understand that." Lydia nodded slowly, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. She could still feel the weight of the knife in her hand, the resistance as it had pierced Jake's flesh. She could hear his voice, that last desperate plea before he collapsed. She had killed him. It didn't matter that it was in self-defense. She had taken a life. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We'll tell them it was self-defense." Alex grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his voice steady as he explained the situation to the operator. Lydia listened, her heart pounding as he described the attack, how Jake had gone mad and tried to kill them both. He made it sound so clear, so logical, but all Lydia could think of was the look in Jake's eyes as he fell to the ground. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the silence of the night. Lydia and Alex were separated as officers took their statements, photographing the scene, marking the bloodstains, and collecting the knife as evidence. Lydia's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold the pen as she signed her statement. Hours later, they were both taken to the station for further questioning. Lydia sat in a cold, sterile room, her mind numb with shock. Detective Parker, a grizzled man with a stern expression, sat across from her, his eyes studying her intently. "Lydia, I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight," he said, his voice calm but firm. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She recounted everything, from Jake's sudden arrival to his violent outburst, to the moment she had grabbed the knife in a desperate attempt to protect herself and Alex. She told him how she had stabbed Jake, how he had collapsed, and how they had called the police immediately afterward. The detective listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Why was Jake in your house, Lydia?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Why would he come here and attack you?" Lydia's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the two-way mirror, feeling as though the walls were closing in on her. He was upset," she stammered. "He thought I was leaving him for Alex. He wasn't thinking straight." The detective's gaze didn't waver. "Were you having an affair with Jake?" Lydia froze, her mind racing. She knew the truth would ruin her, destroy any chance she had of this being seen as self-defense. But the look on the detective's face told her he already knew. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I never wanted it to end like this. I swear." Detective Parker sighed, rubbing his temple. "Lydia, you're going to need a lawyer." As the reality of those words sank in, Lydia felt the last remnants of her world crumble around her. The nightmare had only just begun.